we are putting on a conference called Evolution Exposed.
We pulled in experts on the subject of evolution
For a total of 11 speakers,
and gave them just 15 minutes to give us their best.
and on top of all that, a 1-hour Q&A panel session.
You're going to love Evolution Exposed.
Anyone can refute evolution.
Zoo to the zoo to me and you.
Call that a fairy tale.
Not allowed to ask questions.
It made evolution look ridiculous.
Shows the foolishness of atheism.
I knew I was going to get corrected.
No, I wasn't even listening to your answer.
This guy might be coming for you.
Welcome to Paulogia and another installment of Evolution Exposed, our claim-by-claim investigation of the Creation All-Star Mega Seminar. If you'd like to catch the series from the beginning, tap on the playlist above my head. We're getting deeper into Ray Comfort's lineup of stars, but don't worry, there's still plenty of fun ahead. Next up is Del Tackett, a man with a storied past from military service, to a George Bush Sr. White House technical director, to software engineering, to president of Focus on the Family Institute and the Truth Project, an organization that heavily promoted evangelical family values under the guise of education. Regulars to this channel may recognize him from his Is Genesis History ministry that grew out of the original 2017 Is Genesis History movie that I've covered extensively, including a recent remastered supercut of the whole series. Not wasting his time on small details, Del is using his slot to undermine the entire scientific enterprise.
With the limited time that we have, I thought what we would do is just take a look at the history, not only the history of science, but take a look at what does this current scientific paradigm rest upon? What is its fundamental philosophy?
So this is going to require a heavy hitter, the renegade biologist and science communicator himself, Forrest Valkai.
Hey, Paul, I feel weird.
We are a cartoon.
Oh, I don't like it. Why don't I have bones or skin? I just have colors.
Well, you've been accused of being both animated and two-dimensional, so here we are.
I think I need to rethink my career choices, Paul.
I think that is important for us. It's good for us to be like the sons of Issachar, who understood the times in which they lived. That Hebrew word is banah. It means that we really need to have that kind of wisdom and discernment about the world that we live in.
Ah, yes, because science notoriously does not understand the world in which it lives and has no self-awareness or ability to reflect on itself. Naturally, we must be like the sons of whoever that are able to do what science cannot. I don't know what the sons of Issachar are.
The sons of Issachar are mentioned in one verse in the Bible, but what they are praised for was understanding their times, and apparently they helped King David become King David.
Oh, yeah, no, totally. We don't understand the times, the science folks. Ahoy there, young scientist. Do you know the times? It is that.
Famously, creationists are on top of
the times. Very modern. Yes. Creationism is a very modern, very timely belief system, very up to date with reality.
They have adapted to both the non-existence of a firmament and the spherical nature of the globe. So,
hey, in all fairness, Answers in Genesis is one of the only ones that accepts that dinosaurs exist. But they just happen to say that they exist at the same time as us, and also were on the ark, and also were dragons.
Just a few years ago, I believed all of that.
And since then, you have caught up with, you might say, the times.
The times. It's true.
To talk about what the scientific paradigm that you and I are actually living underneath in our culture, what is its root philosophy, and what does that mean to us? And how do we discuss that with others? So what we need to do, first of all, is take a look at the reality that there have been a number of scientific paradigms in the past. I call your attention to a great book by Thomas Kuhn. It was not well received, as you can imagine, in the scientific world, because what he said as he looked at the history of science and the rise and fall of scientific paradigms, what he was saying is that a paradigm, when it rises, it rules and reigns. In other words, a scientific paradigm comes into to being, and its view of the world begins to rule and reign.
Did he literally just say, he said that this paradigm rules and reigns, and what that means is this paradigm rules and reigns, and didn't elaborate on that at all?
No. No. Yes, thank you for the clarification, Del. That's awesome, very helpful.
And so people who live underneath that paradigm are people who are bound to those questions. They're bound to that paradigm. And to some extent, you're not really allowed to ask questions outside of that paradigm.
Dell's making reference to The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, a 1962 book by Thomas Kuhn. It was received fine. It just wasn't shatteringly impactful, because it was nowhere as bold as Dell is pretending. Kuhn listed historical scientific paradigms like Aristotelian physics, Copernican astronomy, Newtonian mechanics, Darwinian evolution, Einsteinian relativity, and so on and so on. It seems to me that all these things came about precisely because people could ask questions.
Yeah, I'd be fine with the word paradigm in this, but like, it's important to remember that like what shifts us out of one paradigm into another is science. So for the same reason we used to believe in the great chain of being, and then we shifted out of that paradigm when we discovered things like extinction. We used to believe that the universe was static and eternal, and then we shifted out of that paradigm when we discovered things like the regression of galaxies and the cosmic microwave background radiation and redshifting. We used to think that the Earth was static and eternal and the center of the universe. And we shifted out of that paradigm when we discovered that the sun was the center of the solar system and that there were craters on the moon. We used to believe in witchcraft. We used to blame supernatural forces for diseases. And we shifted out of that paradigm when we discovered microbiology, when we started to learn what microbes were and how they work. So this guy sitting here and saying, well, science was wrong sometimes, but the thing that makes it better is more science, not just assuming that there might actually also be some magic involved. And like, we haven't gotten there yet, but dude, I swear to Glob, I would bet so much money that is where he's going to go, is that science has been wrong before, and therefore we need to have a new way of thinking that allows for magic to exist. Otherwise, we won't learn the next thing. And eventually, science is going to prove that we're right. But first, you just got to get out of this materialistic bubble and don't allow yourself to just think in terms of things anymore. That's where it always goes. And I feel like this is going to be a very weird, circuitous route to the most boring creationist argument possible.
You might be a prophet.
And it's not as if there's like the boot squat, so to speak, but our mind is captive by that paradigm. We just don't think outside of that paradigm.
I mean, the scientific process that creationists so rarely understand is not to prove yourself right. It is to fail to prove yourself wrong. That's how we move forward in science. When you can no longer prove an idea incorrect, you then assume that it might be right long enough to test the next thing. And you only know that something is true when it can make testable predictions, when you can apply it to the natural world around you and actually come up with something that makes any kind of sense. It's not like we're all just sitting around the table nodding at each other and agreeing all the time and patting each other on the back and saying, yes, 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 this is the only way the universe works. It is a lot more dynamic than that. And if you actually read scientific literature or take the time to write something, you're constantly trying to find ways to disagree with yourself. And any good scientist is somebody who can tell you all the ways that they could possibly be wrong, but even taking that into account, they think they're probably right. And here's why. That's how we work. And I don't get why people like Dell here don't understand that.
I was doing some listening about Isaac Newton this week, and that was a competitive dude. He was all about, and everyone around him were competitive. They wanted to one-up each other. Status quo was not in the scientific vernacular.
Absolutely not. The history of science, especially the history of biology, in my opinion, is exactly that, is breaking out of the status quo, showing that the way that we thought the entire world worked is wrong over and over and over, knocking humans down off of their pedestal, completely changing the way we think about everything. Over and over and over. It is a messy and scary and difficult practice, and it takes a lot more guts than just saying, no, actually, not only do I know how the entire universe works, I know the guy who made it that way, and I know who he doesn't want me to have sex with, and also I know that he uses he, him pronouns.
But what happens, and what Kuhn is saying, is that in the history of scientific paradigms that as evidence comes in, as evidence becomes more and more apparent, and if it's contradictory to that paradigm, that eventually the weight of the reality causes that paradigm to collapse. And when it collapses, another paradigm arises, and that paradigm will reign and rule until it too collapses as a result of the weight of evidence. Well, we now fast forward to the current paradigm that we are under. That's the one I want to talk about today, and to talk about the philosophy that this paradigm has been wedded to. It's unique in the history of scientific paradigms, and it's important for us to understand that. My personal view is that there will be another paradigm that will rise, and I think that's because the current paradigm that we have...
Say paradigm again. Say paradigm again. I dare you. Say paradigm one more time.
...is going to be overwhelmed with the evidence that is contrary to its position. So here's the important thing to understand in the current paradigm is that the current paradigm is wedded to naturalism.
Neat prediction, bro. Do you have any of that evidence that you'd like to bring to the table today? Or are you just here to sow enough discord about science and scientists that people will start to distrust them and then join your church?
So he just claimed that methodological naturalism is new on the scene and unique in our part of history. What is your understanding of when science adopted methodological naturalism?
It would have been around the 17 into the 1800s, especially, that we really had that major push of saying, actually, you know what? There are concrete, uniform natural processes that appear to be responsible for everything. So for him to say that this is like this new on the scene thing, new on the scene in terms of like 300 years old, yeah. But like even before then, we had like going way back before that, back into like the freaking, the Dark Ages and stuff. You look at the plague in the 1300s, we had science. It was bad science, but there was still naturalism that was being used there. It just wasn't as prominent. And it was very much conflated with or incorporated religious beliefs as well.
But I think that's a feature of what we want to say, right? Like it's that even these theists understood that naturalism was a required part of the scientific method, even though they were undeniably theists.
Yeah, for sure.
And even before they were called scientists, they were called natural philosophers, right?
Yeah, to be a naturalist was a thing. So philosophy used to be the blanket term for any kind of higher thinking. The love of wisdom not only included just thinking about what does it mean to be a person and what does it mean to be moral, but also what's the stuff that makes everything. That goes all the way back to Democritus, who was one of the first people who ever hypothesized the idea of atoms. Even Darwin wasn't hired as a biologist or as an evolutionist or anything. He was hired as a naturalist. A naturalist was just a word for some sort of scientist that could tell you about the natural world. It was all tied together under one big blanket because naturalism was just the way of thinking at that time for educated people.
We've been talking about that. A number of the folks so far have been referring to that worldview, that philosophy that basically believes the world is nothing more than a big black box, and everything exists within that box. In other words, there's nothing outside of the box. There is no God. There is no supernatural. The only thing that is real is the stuff in the box. And of course, pure naturalism says that the only thing in the box is energy and matter.
Love the prop work. Prop work is great in science. We love stuff like that. Also, you're talking about something outside the box and how we don't believe in things that are outside the box. Outside the box in this analogy would be outside of the universe, which is to say outside of everywhere, and also in a place that isn't a place that time doesn't happen. So tell me, Del, what is the thing that lives in a place that isn't where time won't? And how does it do things? What does that mean?
I think there is also a philosophy of spiritual naturalism that tries to put spirit somehow in the box, as in the Forrest be with you, because we need to have something spiritual.
What?
It's energy. surrounds us and binds us. Luminous beings are we, not this crude matter.
It's really, like, I'm not just trying to be a jerk here. It is genuinely difficult to understand if he is saying that there are some scientists who are also spiritual and that's okay, or if he is actually oversimplifying people's supernatural and spiritual beliefs to being like just the Force. There's this quasi supernatural, sort of intelligible thing that sometimes interacts with reality, but you can't quantify it. And it's just this vague, ethereal wiggliness, but also you're mainly a naturalist.
Without the midichlorians, life could not exist, and we would have no knowledge of the Force.
It's difficult to tell if he is trying to make space for those beliefs or making fun of those beliefs. And frankly, it doesn't matter either way because he is yet to say something that is like genuine or coherent in this area.
So what happens when a scientific paradigm then becomes wedded to that philosophy? When it does so, it means that all of its scientific evidence, all of its investigations, no matter how strong the evidence is, the conclusions must always be a natural cause that comes from within inside the box. It is not allowed to point outside of the box. Indeed, it cannot.
Again, Del, if you have just one example of a thing that exists outside that box, of a supernatural explanation for anything that you can actually give us testable, verifiable evidence for, then we would change the paradigm. But you don't, because no creationist ever does. All you can do is try to poke holes in science and try to say that real scientists don't know what they're talking about. But even if that was true, even if you could completely dismantle evolution, even if you could completely throw out the Big Bang, even if you could prove that we knew absolutely nothing about this universe, you would not have done one single thing to back up your claims in creationism, because that is a different idea which requires different evidence, and you have provided none. All you're doing is looking at the real world around you, where actual minds do groundbreaking work, and saying, it's not good enough for me, therefore, probably some guy did it. And I know the guy, and the guy doesn't want you eating shrimp.
If you do point outside the box, then you are no longer scientific. So this is the current paradigm that rules and reigns. It reigns over our textbooks and our schools. It reigns over the ranger who is in the national park. It reigns and rules over the museums. It reigns and rules over media. It controls our culture today, and we all live underneath that paradigm. Now, those of us who think the paradigm is wrong, when we speak of things outside the box, when we speak of an intelligent design, of a purpose in the universe, then we are unscientific, and we have somehow walked outside of the realm of science.
That's because, correct me if I'm wrong, it's because supernaturalistic explanations don't offer testable predictions, right?
Yeah, that's pretty much the long and short of it. I mean, even when we do try to test supernatural claims, they always fall flat. That's why James Randi was so successful. Even in scientific settings, when we try to test, for example, like prayer is a form of healing, we look at patients who are being prayed over and patients who are not being prayed over, and we either see absolutely no difference in their health outcomes, or sometimes the people who are being prayed over actually have worse health outcomes because when prayer doesn't work, they feel bad, and that affects their healing. So this guy has nary a leg to stand on. Why would I say nary like that? What is that? And all he's doing is saying that he doesn't like the way that science works for whatever reason. And so he believes that someday some other scientist is going to do the hard work and prove him right. And until then, he's just going to assume that he is. And that is unscientific, Del. You're unscientific if you believe this stuff. You're unscientific if you do the things that you are doing right now. Also, it is bizarre and totally inappropriate to try to conflate our cultural framework with our scientific framework. Saying that naturalism rules and reigns, which I would love to hear your distinction between those, but whatever. Saying that naturalism rules and reigns over museums and lecture halls and universities and science and all these things is totally fine, and we can have that discussion. But then to extend that into saying it also totally dominates our culture, as if the vast majority of Americans aren't religious, as if creationists aren't a major group of people in this country that have major political sway, as if we're not still passing laws based on our religious beliefs as a culture, is completely absurd. If our culture was half as naturalistic and secular as you're pretending that it is, we wouldn't be dealing with all of the 15th century problems that we are currently trying to fight our way through here in the 21st century.
That has not been the case in the scientific paradigms in the past, as we'll look at Kepler here in just a minute.
Don't you fucking dare invoke the name of Kepler.
So the conclusions of everything that comes from the scientific evidence of this paradigm, the conclusion must always point to a natural cause. It must. It has to.
It's not that it must and it has to, Del. It's that it does. Again, if you can provide any evidence for anything that isn't natural, then we would take that into account.
And so if we think about this, what it means is that the current scientific paradigm has a predetermined outcome. It cannot point to anything else. No matter what the evidence is, it cannot point to anything outside of a natural cause. It is bound by that. So let me look at a couple things with you.
What evidence? Please. What evidence? He keeps saying no matter what the evidence is, as if we're just sweeping things under the rug or deliberately distorting the evidence that we have. What evidence points to something supernatural? What are you actually talking about? Try to make an actual argument rather than just trying to dunk on somebody else's. You might learn how impossible it is.
And you'll be able to see this as it shows itself up in the statements by scientists who are bound by that scientific paradigm. This is from George Wool. Look at what he's saying. Now he's referencing the phrase of spontaneous generation. Spontaneous generation was a theory in the beginning. The theory in the beginning, as you can imagine, that life arose from non-life. That was the phrase of spontaneous generation. So that's what George Wall is addressing here. But think about George Wall now bound by this scientific paradigm. So he says, most modern biologists, having reviewed with satisfaction the downfall of the spontaneous generation hypothesis.
So he's like kind of misrepresenting it, but not too bad. I would bet you $1 million he's about to make it much worse. Essentially, the idea of spontaneous generation was that living things do just spontaneously come into being depending on certain factors. And so, for example, you leave a piece of meat out, you come back the next day, it's got maggots on it. And so the idea was, oh, the maggots appeared because the meat was here. The meat created maggots out of nothing. And that was dismantled by science. You put a piece of meat in a jar with a piece of cheesecloth over the top, the meat still rots, but maggots never appear because flies can't get in to lay their eggs. And so then we understand, oh, they're not just appearing out of the meat. Not all meat just has maggot stuff ready to bloom in it. It's actually eggs that produce new animals. It's actually life that propagates life. And what I'm betting you he's going to do here is take this quote way out of context and say that now abiogenesis is the same thing as this ancient hypothesis of spontaneous generation. And that's ridiculous.
I think a scientist has no choice but to approach the origin of life through a hypothesis of spontaneous generation. Why? Why does he say a scientist has no other option except because within the scientific paradigm, he cannot accept any other conclusion. He is bound by that. He is constrained by that. So Wall goes on to say, one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task to concede spontaneous generation. of a living organism is impossible. And we know that even much more now past George Wold, as we look at the intricate, exquisite design within the living cell, that it is impossible for us to believe in spontaneous generation. That complexity of life cannot arise from random, purposeless forces. And yet what Wold is saying, yes, it's impossible. Yes, it's impossible. Yet here we are. As a result, I believe in spontaneous generation.
So yeah, it's exactly what we thought it was going to be. This person is saying, I have to believe in spontaneous generation for the origin of life. I don't know like what this book is. I haven't read this book. I'm not sure about this scientist. It sounds to me like this is kind of a tongue-in-cheek way of saying, yeah, at a certain point, life would have had to have come from non-life. And that's a very flashy way that creationists like to boil down how abiogenesis works, while ignoring the fact that life comes from non-life all the time. Salt is not alive. And yet when you eat it, you incorporate it into your body. Your neurons don't work without sodium and potassium. You are taking non-living minerals and turning them into living systems. So it's not insane, out of the ordinary, perplexing, difficult to understand in any way to say that 3.8 billion years ago, all the stuff necessary to make early cells was floating in the same tide pool, and so they were able to form together in a way that conforms to the same laws of chemistry and physics as your body obeys today. So for this guy to sit here and try to conflate the hypothesis of spontaneous generation as entire complex high-level organisms just voiping into existence on a piece of rotting meat, with the very first, very simple cells coming together through processes of chemical evolution billions of years ago, is worse than a straw man. It's just conflating two things that this guy clearly has no comprehension of into something that is truly and uniquely just brainless.
Why in the world does he say this? Why does he say, I believe in the impossible? Because he has to say that. He has to say that because the current scientific paradigm will not allow him to say anything else. He is constrained by that.
Or he's convinced by it. That's the other possibility.
Like that's the biggest thing that I cannot get around with people like this, is that they really genuinely seem to believe that scientific understanding of the universe around you, that skepticism, that needing evidence, that only changing your mind when you have a good reason to do so, are all cult-like behaviors, that you are constrained and locked in and chained down and forced to change your mind only in the face of good evidence, when you could just believe what you want to believe if you want to believe it because you want to believe it. And that's what free thinking is. Free thinking is just deciding what you want to believe, whereas this horrible cult of secularism forces you to believe in things because you have evidence for them, instead of being free to believe in the words of a Bronze Age sex manual.
You're a natural at this cartoon thing. You're very animated.
Oh, thank you.
So this is Francis Crick. And his statement, we're just looking at a few of these scientists who are bound, constrained by the scientific paradigm, and what it forces them to say against all reason.
Francis Crick, famously just a rule follower and the consensus man.
Francis Crick always said, I'll just believe whatever I'm told to believe and do whatever I'm told to do. That's why he never discovered anything, because he just went along, keeping along, following the rules.
So Francis Crick, co-discoverer of DNA, is now facing the evidence. Now looking at DNA, facing the evidence that this is impossible, that this could have arisen by chance.
Wait till this guy figures out that nucleic acids can self-assemble and polymerize and replicate all on their own, and we actually have laboratory experiments showing that. But go off, I guess.
And so what does Crick turn to? Does he turn to a created possibility, turn to a creator? Look at what he's saying. An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now from DNA, could only state that in some sense that our origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied.
Almost. Of course, because famously in the world of science, almost a miracle means it's actually secretly a miracle, and I just can't admit it.
But what Francis Crick turned to was not then the notion of even intelligent design or turning to the creation by a creator. Francis Crick then came up with the theory of directed panspermia, the theory that first living cell well then must have come from outer space. Well, all that does is put the problem off. That it didn't arise here by chance, so it must have come in from a spaceship from somewhere else.
So his actual complaint here is that Francis Crick proposed a solution that is within the realm of probability, if not a little bit unsatisfactory, whereas he should have just said it was probably magic. That's seriously the hill you want to die on, Del? Just imagine if we use that same kind of thinking at any other time. Malaria is called malaria because the word malaria literally means bad air. We didn't know what parasites were. We didn't understand how parasitic diseases were transmitted by mosquitoes. We thought that the night air was poisonous, and if you breathed in the night air too much, you would come down with malaria. Imagine if we stuck with that kind of thinking. In that time in history, if someone had come along and said, no, actually, there are tiny, tiny microorganisms that are smaller than blood cells. Also, by the way, there's things called blood cells, and they live inside the mosquitoes, and they get inside your blood and inside your liver, and that's what's making you sick. That person would have been laughed out of the room, even though that is a naturalistic explanation. And Del here would prefer that person to say, no, actually, it is just magical air. It's the air that just has evil spirits in it that's causing you, because that's outside of the naturalistic paradigm, which means it's something valid and reasonable that we should really be giving more attention to. This guy would not take himself seriously if he was arguing the exact same way for any other supernatural position besides creationism. They never do.
Now, of course, when we look at DNA and what's happening in DNA, one of my favorites is the topoisomerase. The topoisomerase is something that Francis Crick didn't understand, but Francis Crick knew that somehow the DNA had to be parted in order for that code to be read. Well, he didn't know how that was possible, but now we do. And here's what it is. There's a machine within the living cell called the topoisomerase. And when the cell needs a new carburetor, for example, the topoisomerase somehow knows exactly where that code is. It goes down the DNA strand, and what Crick understood is that if you pull apart the DNA, then it's going to supercoil as a result of all of these windings. Well, the topoisomerase goes to that DNA, it clips the DNA at the start of that instruction set, clips it at the bottom of that instruction set, unwinds it, the mechanisms come in to read the cell, the new carburetor is made, and when the new carburetor is made, the topoisomerase winds that piece up again, puts it back into the DNA, welds it back together, and then goes on. And he said, are you kidding me? That anyone would look at this and say that this has to be a random, purposeless, mindless result of a random, purposeless, mindless forces. No one would reasonably say that unless they are bound by a scientific paradigm that requires them to do that.
So most of that is fine. There are actually two different kinds of topoisomerase that do slightly different things, but like overall, yeah, topoisomerase clips DNA and then binds it back together. It's one of a couple different enzymes that does that. But of course, that whole rant was loaded with really misleading language, like saying that it just somehow knows where to go, as if there aren't target sequences that topoisomerase and other enzymes are able to recognize and bind to in order to do what they're supposed to do. And that's what's so funny about this, is if this guy actually were to go take a cell bio class, he would notice that the instructor, someone who actually studies and teaches this stuff for a living, is never going to say that it's just miraculous, that it's magical, that it's something that we don't understand. Because when you get into molecular biology, you start to learn just how specific these things are and just how well they work in a very, very specific context. It's not like these things are just floating around looking at the DNA and be like, I guess I should go over here today and just try cutting and see what happens. It's not random. It's not magic. It's not guided. They don't have brains. It is just basic chemical and physical laws that are guiding these interactions. It's not magic. It's science. And we know that because it actually works.
These are just some of the logic maps that we find within the DNA processing within a living cell. They are complex. They're exquisitely complex.
I would pay real money to watch him explain what any one of those charts means. Seriously, one of them. One flow chart from that whole page of like, what do you got up there? Like 5 or 6? Pick one and explain what it actually means. I will donate $100 to a charity of my choice if I actually get to see that video.
When I was working in the field of artificial intelligence, we were looking for a random number generator. And if that random number generator ever began to produce a pattern, then we had to throw it out. So if you look at numbers like this and you say they're random, but all of a sudden you begin to see a pattern in them, you know it's not random.
Yeah, when you do something random enough, you tend to find patterns in it. That is the argument for things like abiogenesis or the formation of planets and stars, which that isn't random at all. That's just gravity working. But like when you talk about this ridiculous straw man of like, oh, you're telling me all this random chance made something like life, and then you're going to sit here and say, I literally made random number generators for a living, and they regularly produce patterns. How can you not see what you are actually saying? How are you not hearing yourself?
The same is true when we look around, look at the world around us. Whether we're looking at DNA, the puffer's fish, and how it makes a pattern in the sand.
Pufferfish, they create these big patterns in the sand. They make these big geometric patterns in order to attract mates. So that's an evolved behavior to attract mates. And this dude is looking at this and saying, Jesus, what? I still don't get the point. So I think what he's saying here is that there is an intelligence, even a pufferfish level intelligence, behind these patterns, and there's an intelligence behind Stonehenge. Therefore, there's an intelligence behind DNA. And that would make sense. And as someone who also used to be 5 years old, I can understand why he might think that. But the problem is that DNA, while it is very intricate and very organized, isn't anything like those other things. It just isn't. And to say this is complex, therefore it must have some sort of designer, and then this other thing is complex, therefore it must also have a designer, is as vapid as me saying my shoes and my wallet are both made of leather, therefore I should be putting my feet in my wallet. Just because two things share a characteristic does not mean that they share the same source or any other definitive characteristic. That is not how thinking works. I do not understand why creationists keep relying on this argument.
And even in crime scene, we know investigators they're not looking, we hope they're not constrained to a natural cause, or we would never discover that there was a murder here. We would never discover that someone was an arson who started the fire. If you superimpose upon the crime scene investigation team that says, look, investigate the crime, but you are not allowed to point to an intelligent cause. In other words, a man-made God. Everything that you have to find must be found to be natural.
Whoa. So, no.
That is the single dumbest thing I've heard today.
Crime scene investigation is allowed to look for intelligent causes. What they are not allowed to look for is supernatural causes. Case closed, everyone. It was a ghost. Your Honor, we're pressing charges against the demon and his leprechaun accomplice.
But that's not even what he's getting at. He's just conflating the word intelligence with the word supernatural. And so he's saying, imagine a crime scene where we can't say any intelligent agent caused it, and there must be only a natural explanation, as if humans aren't natural. As if humans doing things is not a natural explanation. If somebody stabbed somebody else, that was a natural process caused by natural people behaving in natural ways. How are you going to sit here and say without the supernatural, we wouldn't be able to explain crime? What is wrong with you?
One of the things that this then forces the scientific paradigm into is that it forces it into the notion that there must be deep time. In other words, if everything came about as a result of random processes, then we must have deep time in order to answer the question.
The understanding that natural processes are involved in everything we see around us does not necessitate a belief in deep time. The thing that necessitates a belief in deep time is the evidence for deep time. Where is your evidence for a guy that wants you to not trim the sides of your hair and beard, as I see you have done, Del, that also created people out of mud?
All right, here's another quote from Walt, and then we'll finish. He said, "Time is the hero of the plot. What we regard as impossible on the basis of human experience is meaningless here. Given so much time, the impossible becomes possible."
They love a good quote mine.
They do, because if you can't say anything intelligent, get somebody else who said something intelligent and make it sound stupid, and then you win. That's an honest, kind, generous, truthful, respectable, not at all disgusting way to go about trying to spread your ministry, Del. Thank you very much.
That is the end result of a paradigm that is wedded to the naturalism philosophy. Dawkins then says, if you don't believe this, you're wicked. And yet Kepler in the very beginning says,
wait, what did Dawkins say?
He didn't even show anything. He just said Dawkins says that.
That's like, so it was absolutely safe to say that if you meet someone who claims not to believe in evolution, that person is ignorant, stupid, or insane, or wicked, but I'd rather not consider that.
Of course. Richard Dawkins, the single figurehead of all science and all atheism, whom we all accept and agree with completely unquestioningly. This just shows that this person has no concept of how to think outside of dogma. He believes in a single God, in a single church, in a single book that is completely without error and completely beyond question. And so he thinks that we do too. If he can quote mine a scientist, any big biologist with a big name in public atheism, and say, this guy said something, then he assumes that we all must agree with it. And if he can prove that one thing wrong, then we are all wrong. This is exactly the same kind of nonsense that people like Answers in Genesis and Ray Comfort do.
And I'm reading this quote again. I think by wicked, he means a grifter.
Presumably. Yeah.
And if you swap the word grifter in there, I'm not even sure I disagree with this.
No, honestly, at the end of the day, that is what organizations like these do. It's trying to get you to question your most basic cognitive faculties and question the science that gives you all of the luxuries and privileges and health that you have today in your day-to-day life. All of that is wrong because we have a book that says that the earth was flooded and that you're the product of extreme incest, and therefore you need to give us money. You need to be buying into our things. You need to exit through the gift shop. Like, it is always a grift.
And yet Kepler in the very beginning says, what's the purpose of science? The aim of all investigation of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God. That is a scientific paradigm that is not constrained by naturalism, but is allowed to look at the evidence to see the creator.
Bringing up Kepler believing in God is like bringing up Newton believing in God. These people were religious and they were scientists. These were two different things, non-overlapping magisteria, as they've been called. It doesn't mean that your God is real because a smart person believed in it. The thing that would convince me that your God is real is literally any evidence at all.
He said that we're living in this unique paradigm now and that it was somehow counter to God. And yet it was founded by God-believing people who still kept methodological naturalism as part of what they do day to day because they needed science to make testable, predictable predictions.
It's also incredibly ironic that he would be quoting Kepler here and saying, look, Kepler believed in God knows it, when a big thing that Kepler did was to overturn the belief that planets orbited in perfect circles, which was Copernicus's idea, because perfect circles meant that God is perfect and made all these perfect circles and perfect spheres everywhere. And Kepler came along and developed Kepler's laws, showing that these aren't actually circles, they're ellipses, and he actually used mathematics to show how planets are orbiting not in perfect ways. And that was a major issue for Christians at the time. So You're sitting here and saying, well, Kepler believed in God. Meanwhile, Kepler's overturning Copernicus's things, and Copernicus was big after Galileo, who was also going against the church, and Galileo was after all these other people who were going against the church. Kepler is one in a long line of scientists who were proving the church wrong over and over and over again, but he also happened to be a Christian, and that means the Bible is literally true. Get all the way bent, dude.
Well, that's the end of Dell's 15 minutes of stage time. Final thoughts?
No, I'm going to go walk into the ocean, and maybe I'll come back and do another video someday.
Well, just in case he does, please go back and check out Forrest's highly educational and entertaining YouTube channel, and leave a comment to let him know that Paulogia sent you. Next up on Evolution Exposed, we have John Harris of Living Waters Europe, who will attempt to disprove evolution by talking about aliens.
Now, on the other hand, if you're a Christian, you might think, well, why not? We know God is all powerful and able, so if he wanted to, he could create life on another planet. If he can, then why wouldn't he?
See you over there. Later.